Hi, I'm Bill Kristol. Welcome to Conversations. I'm very pleased to have joining me today my friend Jonah Goldberg, senior writer. What is your title?
I'm
Senior
a senior
editor,
at
National
National
Review.
Review,
It's so complicated.
and a fellow at the American
but
Institute.
not a senior fellow at the American Institute. You're too young to be a senior
That's
fellow.
blue sky. That's
That's something to aspire to
Exactly,
later in life.
yeah.
Anyway, at the American Enterprise Institute, very thoughtful observer of and participant in our national public life in general.
It's kind of you to say.
And sort of conservatism in particular, I would say. So I think we had a conversation in the summer, and it was about the meaning of candidate Trump, I guess nominee Trump at that point.
Right.
Now we're speaking 3 weeks after Election Day. We now have President-elect Trump. What's your take on that? What does it mean?
Well, it's like you should get a Mrs. Lincoln joke in there somewhere. I have to say, as like I'm sure you did, I talked to a lot of reporters doing sort of thumbsuck pieces about what the Trump campaign means and what it will mean once Hillary wins, and I was in this mindset of, my gosh, if Trump wins, which I didn't think was going to happen, I'm hardly alone in that judgment. I've always thought it would be very difficult, if not impossible, for him to win the popular vote, and I was right.
Right.
But I kind of assumed, given how out there I was on all of this, that I would be in a deep, horrible funk about it if he won, and it turns out I'm not. I woke up Wednesday after the election in a shockingly good mood. We get to court. We're going to do something, I don't know quite yet what, about Obamacare and the executive orders. We might get some good tax reform. So there's a good policy environment going on. We held the House, we held the Senate, or the Republicans did. I should stop referring to myself in the we when I talk about Republicans. But for me personally, I mean, you've been around the block longer than I have on this kind of stuff. This is the first time in my professional life where I have zero ownership of a Republican president, and it's incredibly liberating. And so it dawned on me that going forward, if Donald Trump does things that I think are good, I will say so. I mean, my whole mantra for 18 months is my job is to tell the truth as I see it, and I will continue to do that. And so if he does things that I think are good, that's great. My side wins, my arguments win, my team, such as it is, wins. And if he reverts back to the character that I thought was on ample display during much of the campaign, I get to say I told you so.
Right.
So it's sort of win-win. And my guess is it's going to be see all of the above. He's going to do some really good things. I think some of his appointments, with a couple of exceptions, have been pretty top-notch, sort of thing you could expect from most Republicans. And the thing I worry about is still, it's not ideological, although I've always had my problems with him ideologically. It's characterological. Right. It's what happens. I think he was rightly and honorably, and to his credit, sobered by the fact that he actually won. I don't think he planned on winning. And so this period that we're in now, the best analogy I can think of is to the first 30 minutes of the first debate, where he took it really seriously and he held it together. I think the awesomeness of the job, you could see it on his face, how nervous he was when he met with Obama in the White House that first time. He's taking it seriously, good for him, a couple tweets notwithstanding. What I worry about is 6 months from now, when he takes it as a given. Of course they play Hail to the Chief when I enter the room, and of course the Marines salute me, and of course I'm the leader of the free world, and he feels none of the sting of his own insecurity and conscience about how to handle himself as President of the United States. That worries me, but I've been wrong about other things. Maybe I'll be wrong about that too.
Yeah, let's hope for the country's sake, and there could be lesser and greater versions of that.
Sure,
problem,
and you have to give him a chance, though. You only have one
totally.
president at a time. I think the left are making fools out of themselves.
Right.
People ask about, will you support impeachment if he needs to be impeached? Like, well, let's wait for him to do something that's worthy of that. Until then, you give the guy a chance, give the system a chance. We have a system of checks and balances. This may be, as you've been arguing, sort of invigorating for some of the, up until now, fairly moribund and atrophied elements of our system of checks and balances as people rise to this occasion on both the right and the left. So we'll see. I wish him the best, though.
Well, I want to talk about the left, actually, since you mentioned it. I think liberalism is having more of an internal debate and crisis, maybe, than people realize, and then really pick your brain, obviously, on conservatism, talk about the culture more broadly, but just on the feeling of liberation the night after, on Wednesday, after the election. I mean, I think your colleague, Ramesh Purura, I think this was his line. I at least gave him credit for it and quoted him, as he told it to me, a couple months before the election, which was, we were all somewhat depressed, Clinton versus Trump. And he said, well, look at the bright side. I mean, one of them will lose. And that will be, you'll be happy about that. And I've got to say, the sense, I'm not a Hillary obsessive or hater, I think, I don't, but the sense of liberation one had, that she will not be in the White House, the Clintons will not be in the White House, the Clinton world will not be, we're going to have to think about it for the next 4 or 8 years. Didn't you? I think that was a big part of, for conservatives at least, of actually for a lot of liberals too, I think, a sense of like a big weight going off our back here, you know?
And I agree with that entirely. This is pristine territory. It's an exciting, new, brave world, and it doesn't feel like flashback. Whatever problems lie ahead, they're new, interesting problems rather than the same plodding problems you had with the Clintons. But I do think that that touches on an important point that has been lost in a lot of the discussion, particularly on the right. Yeah, Donald Trump did something really impressive, and you got to give him credit for his victory. But the real story of that election was that Hillary Clinton lost more than Donald Trump won. I mean, it's a binary thing, so if one loses, the other one wins. But Hillary Clinton, it's becoming abundantly clear, was as I said for 2 years beforehand, was a terrible candidate for the Democrats, but ran a really bad campaign and spent more money in like the 2nd district of Nebraska than they did in Wisconsin. I mean, they lost as much as Donald Trump won, and the beautiful thing is that the Democrats are not learning from that lesson, or I shouldn't say beautiful thing, the amazing thing. I mean, Barack Obama said this week that the main reason they lost is because every bar and restaurant in the country is playing Fox News, and they can't get their message on him.
It's like, what bars and restaurants does he go to? I mean, not to take his comment too literally, but seriously, it's literally false. I mean, bars and restaurants, I'd say male-oriented ones play sports, right? I mean, ESPN's on all day. I don't know what a more female-oriented restaurant would be. Well, they would play The View or something, The Voice. I mean, it would be kind of mainstream cultural entertainment, I would say. Airports play CNN.
Right.
I actually bet very few people. I mean, because playing Fox is a little bit, put off. Some of your patrons wouldn't like it. Anyway, it just shows like what a ridiculous bubble he's living in, or I don't know.
And it just as a matter of
excuses.
Well, the bubble thing is sort of fascinating, right? Because first of all, he goes to very few restaurants.
Yes.
And the one thing I guarantee you, every manager at every restaurant does
not put on
when Barack Obama shows up, is like, let's turn off Sean Hannity.
Well, I don't think the DC and Martha's Vineyards and East Hampton places he goes to. A, they don't have TVs on, and B, they're not showing Fox News.
Yeah.
No,
so but also they're doubling. They're gonna looks like they're gonna make Keith Ellison the head of the Democratic Party. They're in a deep state of denial. And there was some left-wing magazine that came out with a headline: "If Jon Stewart was still hosting the Daily Show, Hillary would have won."
I think the liberals think there's one true fact that they can hang on to, which is the Democrats have won the popular vote in 6 of the last 7 elections, and demography still, Trump could turn this around, but it's kind of going in their direction, you might say. Their groups are growing a little, and the Trump groups are shrinking a little. And so that seems to be their core fact. The core conservative and Republican fact, which I think might turn out to be equally or almost equally misleading, is Republicans control everything. They've never been as strong since 1928, and it's like so let's talk about maybe each of those. I mean, I think if we agree that there's probably too much, it is interesting. The one thing this election does not seem to be prompting, which it should be, is rethinking. Well, maybe it is on the right. That's a question, I suppose. But so liberalism. You're a student of liberalism. You wrote a whole book about liberalism. I mean, where does it go? I mean, just analytically, what would you expect over the next 2-4 years in terms of both the party and the liberal intellectuals? And are we at the end of an era? I mean,
again, I mean, we're sort of in this transition period, right, where we don't know what lessons people are going to take from these things. It does seem to me that in sort of our political liberalism, rather than sort of the liberal culture, there's this tendency going back to the early 20th century of utter and complete disdain for fly over America, even before we could fly over it, right?
Yeah, right.
Christopher Lasch writes about this beautifully, and I think the One and Only Heaven, One and Only True Heaven, so on, where he has this wonderful, long discussion just going through all of the sort of muckrakers and intellectuals of the sort of progressive era, and their visceral contempt. You know, the Nation magazine wrote in these United States, where they just went from one sort of middle American state to another, mocking and ridiculing these rubes and hicks. And I think that tradition has lived on for a very, very long time, and it comes back. It's very much a city mouse versus a country mouse kind of mindset. You know, there's a horrible line from Bill Maher, who says the job of the Democratic Party is to drag the slack-jawed yokels that make up half this country into the future and all that.
Yeah.
And I think Ross Douthat, our friend Ross Douthat, wrote about this well, is that the cultural left has a Samantha Bee problem, where they think that because they watch a handful of sneering, smug, condescending shows on Showtime, HBO,
I myself have never seen Samantha Bee, so
Yeah.
I take it she is such a
but John Oliver,
she is such a condescending
Trevor
comic.
Noah. It's
Yeah.
all this sort of I don't know anybody who knows people who drive a pickup truck, so let's make fun of everybody who has a pickup truck,
Right,
kind of
or
thing.
owns a gun,
Or owns a gun, or goes to church regularly, or any of that kind of stuff. And I think because the donor class of the Democratic Party comes from that, their kids watch that, they think it's hip, they think it's now, they confuse their kids with youth culture generally, that they have a deep and abiding bubble about this coastal elite attitude.
Right.
And it's translated itself into democratic politics. And I think one of the things that a lot of us didn't take into account, particularly a lot of liberals didn't take into account, was the degree to which Barack Obama was a charismatic personality as a politician, but he actually represented a side of a cultural argument that a lot of people really don't like. And he could pull it off, but it's sort of like, in the primaries, there were a lot of Trump mini-me's who tried to run as Donald Trump's. Like I ran against that idiot who ran against Paul Ryan.
Right.
There were a few others. And they all failed fairly abysmally, because it turns out that if you're not Donald Trump, acting like Donald Trump just is sort of asinine.
Right.
And acting like Barack Obama without being Barack Obama comes across as sort of smug, effete, and elitist. And I don't think that is a pose that can work for the Democratic Party when you generalize it out, which is why this guy Ryan is running against Nancy Pelosi, who's sort of the queen, the matriarch of that sort of San Francisco liberalism.
And even Obama, who is a very talented politician, I mean, at the end of the day, it's 52%, 51% in general elections, the first after Bush being with horrible approval ratings, the second against Romney, not a perfect candidate with a bit of an economic recovery, just enough to take him over the edge a bit. But of course, the Democrats had terrible losses. You might have thought, looking back, they would have realized that 2010 and 2014 were harbingers of a problem they had in Middle America. They rationalized that it's a different electorate and so forth. It turned out the 2016 electorate was a little more like 2014 in the sense that just the kind of people who turned out. Trump was able to turn out what people had considered a mid-year electorate in some respects.
In certain states.
Midterm states, in certain states.
Yeah.
I mean, but I think that's very interesting about liberals, about Obama's effect. They really are. I mean, I've been worried as a conservative and friendly to Republicans about Republican donors. I think they distort Republican elected officials' view of the world to some degree. But I guess now that you mention it, the Democratic donors are more cloistered. I mean, you really are talking L.A., San Francisco, New York.
Right.
Like the Boston, a tiny bit of Chicago. But I mean, so they don't have any connection with non-blue state, non-culturally hip, progressive.
The Tom
America.
Steyer types, right, who think that you can build a major mass populist movement over something like climate change with the voters that we actually have in this electorate.
Right.
They're delusional. So we got a huge turnout on campus at Oberlin. Well, that is, that's not a bellwether. And I think that there is that cocooning, that cultural cocooning among liberals, and they don't understand and what I do think is sort of fascinating, though, is the degree to which, and we talk about them not learning the right lessons, right? So a week before the election, every liberal analyst pundit was talking about the Democratic blue wall, their firewall, and how they had this inherent advantage in the Electoral College. They then lose, thanks mostly to the voters who were for 100 years, the core of the
Right.
FDR Democratic Coalition,
Right.
right? These working class whites. And immediately, the response is they're all racists, and the Electoral College itself is an institution of white supremacy. So a week before the election, they were bragging about how this institution of white supremacy
that's good,
was
yeah.
their inherent advantage in any election. And
Right.
then it turned out when it blew up in their faces. But that sort of impulse to automatically go to these buzzwords of white privilege, white supremacy, and all the rest, and don't get me wrong, I think Donald Trump helps them in that regard, and so does Steve Bannon and all of that. They make it easier for those arguments to be made. But nonetheless, when you're actually trying to appeal to actual voters, telling them that you're all white supremacists and racists for voting for this guy who says he's going to bring jobs back from Mexico, reinforces the message that the Democrats are out of touch, I think.
The one moment I thought, and I said a few times that I thought Trump could win, was when people just went on and on about the blue wall, which was intelligent enough. I mean,
Sure.
Ron Brownson did a lot of work on this, and it was a true fact. I mean, the Democrats had won these states since '84 or '88.
Yeah.
But I came to Washington in '85, and then, of course, Dukakis having been ahead lost in '88. There was a huge amount written in '89, 90, 91 about the Republican electoral
Right. Bill Schneider had an Atlantic cover about the Republican lock on the electoral
lock. That
vote.
was a lock. Could they pick the lock? Very hard to pick the lock, electoral lock.
Yeah.
Democrats have, of course, beginning in '92, won most of the elections and won the popular vote in almost all of them. And all these places that Republicans had had for a long time, California and
Right.
others, sort of just totally went south, Ohio. So I've always, as soon as everyone agreed on the blue wall, I figured something would go wrong, wrong with it. But it is funny that it's, yes, you say particularly not funny, but interesting that particularly the historical Democratic voters in those states
Right.
were the ones who broke it open. I mean, often I'd say parties and movements, and they start off with one lesson from an election. They think that everyone should take a certain lesson, and then everyone goes the opposite direction. I've been struck how many times that happens. People are very bad at it. I mean, this is not a criticism of people, it's just a fact that, you're predicting the future, or the initial response is often, this is true in life too, right, is often not the second or third
Right.
order response, or the response 3 months in. So,
Well, it's funny.
I mean, it's like the Republicans, they were going to have, God, the only way you can win in 2016 is the autopsy, right?
Right.
Run a Marco Rubio type and run this thing. They run the guy who's the most opposite of what every enlightened, and I really most intelligent, I would even say, Republicans thought more or less in 2013.
Yeah.
And the guy wins, for the first time, wins the biggest electoral vote number for Republicans since '88. So,
There's a great line I quote often from an essay by Orwell called Second Thoughts on James Burnham, where he points out that intellectuals throughout the war, whenever there was a setback in the war, or whenever there was a victory in the war, immediately made straight line projections to defeat or victory, right? And it's like, oh, we lost to Brooke, that means the war is over, or oh, we got back to Brooke, that means we're going to win. And Orwell makes the point that if you ask the average Brit on the streets throughout the war, of course we're going to win. We're British. We will win. And turns out that they were right. And the problem is that intellectuals he says it's a form of power worship, that you make straight line projections because you want to get on board.
there's some truth to that.
And I think there is, you saw that a lot this year
Yes, I agree
with a lot of our friends, I think. But we don't need to get too deep into that.
Yeah. No, I think that is true. But they always want to be on the right, and also to be early in seeing the wave that's coming. So
right.
there's a huge, I've seen this in politics so many times, I've been guilty of it a few times, huge overinterpretation of any one event.
Yeah.
This is decisive. Now it's going to go downhill directly or whatever. And of course, things change and reverse. And the surge was the most dramatic, finally, in my time in Washington in terms of an actual real world thing.
Yeah.
But politically, it's also true. There's a bad day for Trump. He's finished. It's over.
Right.
So, James Comey comes out. Clinton has no chance. Then she still wins. Popular vote by 2 million. I mean, people just overinterpret events in general because the public is much less event-driven. I mean, they sort of have views.
They tune in every now and then.
Yeah, they have a general view. One thing does not freak them out the way all of us who have to comment on it every day does.
Right. Although conservatives are, I think, more hypocritical about this tendency. I think it's a natural human tendency, but liberals are the ones who believe in 5-year plans, right? And that you can rationally plan the future, and and conservatives, we're supposed to believe, along with Burke, that society's infinitely complex and
Hayek,
you can't predict the
right.
future, and yet conservative pundits do it all the time.
Totally. Yeah, it's good. It's a good reminder. I should remind myself of that more. So, final point on liberalism, just before we get, I want to talk about conservatism, but liberalism. So, having said we can't plan, we don't know. I mean, I'm sort of struck. it doesn't seem to me there's much of a Bill Clinton, Bill Galston type rethinking going on. I mean, Bill Clinton himself has now been quoted, and I gather this is true from people I've talked to, as saying that he had been warning for the past month of the last month of the campaign that, hey, we do need some white votes here, some white working class. They get to vote too, you know. We can't just do this kind of, you know, picking very careful coalition of some college-educated upscale whites and some minorities.
Overperforming with Hmong in Minnesota.
Yeah. So I mean, and Bill Galston's been out. Look at some of the old Clinton Democrats have weighed in, but one doesn't feel either from reading liberal columnists and journals or from watching the Democratic Party that that's the reaction. And I think don't you think it could go the other way? Bernie Sanders, Elizabeth Warren seem to be where the energy of the party is.
I think that's right, and I think part of psychologically what's going on is that there are a lot of Democrats who suspect that, first of all, Hillary did steal the nomination from Bernie Sanders.
Right.
The WikiLeaks stuff kind of suggests that maybe there's merit there, and two, that Bernie Sanders would have beaten Donald Trump. I don't know that that's true.
Right.
I actually kind of think it's not, but who knows? But so they feel like, you know, if only we had doubled down on our Obama-ness, right? I mean, that's always been the gripe about Obama, is that he didn't own his left-wingness enough.
Right.
And so I think that there's this sort of notion that if we were just, you know, it's sort of Howard Deanism, you know, if we just we're pure form of our true selves, we'll win over everybody. And conservatives have been prone to that kind of thinking quite a bit over the last 20 years, and it doesn't go very far.
Well, I was thinking, as you said it, conservatives were very prone to this 50 years ago, more. Nixon loses to John Kennedy in 1960. Not entirely dissimilar. Nixon, not a very charismatic or attractive candidate, but a very experienced guy and all. Eisenhower has 2 terms, like Obama. Loses a very close race to Kennedy. And the reaction among conservatives was, I mean, they disagreed with Eisenhower and Nixon, so they had an ideological issue, just like Sanders and Warren do. But they also talked themselves into as a electoral matter, analytical matter, that there's a huge hidden conservative vote out there, and if only we finally nominate the Barry Goldwater wing of the party, and indeed, let's just nominate Barry Goldwater, we'll win in '64. Now, maybe he would have had a better chance if there hadn't been an assassination and all this kind of stuff. Right. It's hard to know, but it is interesting that the reaction to Nixon's losing to Kennedy was Goldwater, not, I don't know, a Rockefeller or Bill Scranton or a new generation of, you know, moderates or something like that.
Well, that was also Ted Cruz's theory, right?
Right.
And the problem is that he was, it seems to me, I mean, I haven't crunched these numbers or anything, but it seems to me he was half right. And that what Trump did was he activated these people not based upon conservative ideology, but in terms of this sort of anti-establishment populism thing, which I don't think Ted Cruz was a good messenger for.
Well, because trade was such an important part of it, I do think.
Right.
And there, Cruz just had standard, I mean, I think correct, but standard, you know, free trade views. So liberalism, so they really could go left, which would be, I mean, Trump could be an extremely lucky man. I was thinking about this. I mean, I think, a very skillful demagogue. I underrated him, et cetera. I plead guilty, certainly in terms of analytically missing in the primaries, especially that he would win. I always thought he had a chance in the general, but you know, what if he does have a Democratic Party that goes so far left that whatever mistakes Trump makes and off-putting things he does and even policies that may not work out so well, the alternative is some, you know, I don't know what it would be exactly. Who would be?
Well,
I guess that's hard to tell.
It's sort of a McGovern problem, right? So 72.
Yeah, that's right. So Trump is Nixon in 68.
Right, and he's very Nixonian, right? I mean, he's law and order.
So you get an administration that's kind of a mess.
Right.
Conflicting views. Does one or two things pretty well, though.
Yeah.
Gets us out of Vietnam in a decent way, you might say, as of 72, and sort of restores a kind of civil peace.
Yeah.
Goes horribly anti-conservative on a whole bunch of things.
Yeah, well, Nixon hated the Buckleyites, right? He hated the conservatives, and he tried to. I mean, that's the thing that's really amazing. About
but then he won, and I think National Review didn't officially support Nixon in '72. Is that right? Or
well, I know we didn't in '60.
Yeah, I said '60. That's right. In '72, I think they supported Ashcroft in the primaries.
Ashbrook,
I'm sorry. Yeah. In the primary as a kind of a token challenger. I guess they must have supported Nixon against. But yeah, then he wins a massive re-election victory. Right. So that if you get enough, if the other party goes enough to the other side,
right? And this is something
that's a good analogy.
That has confused people, I think, for generations. Is, and I think the right has this is a human nature problem. It is not unique to the left. That if you hate somebody, you assume they're ideologically your opposite, when in reality it's like. Nixon was the last New Deal president, really. I mean, he created the EPA, he was founder of affirmative action, he bragged about how they spent more on social services than they did on defense, wages and price controls. I mean, you go down this long list of things. But the left hated him and could never forgive him ever since the Helen Douglas or whatever the anti-communist stuff, and they thought he was a petty tyrant and all the rest, and so they assumed that ideologically he was a crazy right winger, but he wasn't. We went through something like that in the 90s where we couldn't stand Bill Clinton, in part because he was stealing Republican and conservative issues, and so people treated him as if he was this crazy communist, and I think that Trump has got this very advantageous position where his voters, first of all, when 60% of the electorate thinks you're not qualified to be president, you actually have remarkable room for improvement in people's minds, right? And if you look at what the voters want him to do, among Republicans at least, it's a pretty conventional Republican thing. And most Republicans don't, in fact, want him to be the crazy demagogue stuff that people fear he's going to be. So he's got a remarkable amount of maneuvering room. And if the left keeps taking the bait and burning flags every time he says, you shouldn't burn flags, it gives him this Nixonian opportunity to hold the center. The conservatives will hold their nose, and people like National Review might gripe, but if they go with Elizabeth Warren style liberalism or McGovern style liberalism, it gives him this incredible space to be a modestly center-right president who, if he just doesn't round people up, people will think, wow, that's a pleasant surprise.
And the real populist touch or pseudo-touch, whatever it is, but which he does, and that's a little like Nixon with the hard hats and all, but I mean, way beyond in terms of what he's sort of willing to do and say. But well, so what about conservatism? Let's pivoting to that. I mean, again, very hard to say. So much depends on what Trump does. As someone else made a point to me, it also depends on whether he succeeds. I mean, it's a huge difference if the president, who for all the people like us were not for him, I mean, is sort of on your side of the aisle, has a successful 4 years or an unsuccessful 4 years, it makes a big difference in the way people think about it. Having said all that, what do you think? I mean, are we at a moment where people are going to say this is like, there was a wave, there was a conservative movement that lasted from, 55 with Buckley, or really with Robert Taft, you can 48, and then goes through Reagan and the Goldwater nomination and defeat, the Reagan failure in 76, the Reagan success, then Gingrich, and even into, this century, obviously, and then it ended. I mean, somehow we're in a new moment, or is this more of a one-off, a blip, mid-course correction?
I agree with you entirely. It's too soon to tell, right? I do think, going back to the Nixon thing for a moment, that this is at least the election was the fulfillment of a young Pat Buchanan's dream, right? Yeah. Pat Buchanan used to write these memos to Nixon in the White House saying how we have to get rid of the guys down at the yacht marina and go with the guys having lunch at the construction site, and we need to create a new white working class populist party that rejects Wall Street and favors Main Street and all that kind of stuff. And that's the coalition that Trump basically put together, and it's to give him his winning margin, right? I mean, he still had to have rank and file conservatives and evangelicals and all those to do this. And so, Matt Continetti, who we both know, obviously, had that interesting piece where he's talking about how basically this was the fulfillment of bringing in the Wallace voters into the Republican coalition. When the left winger hears that, they think, oh, that means you brought in all the racists. Right. Yeah, racism was part of it, but there was a lot of other stuff going on in the Wallace vote, and so I think
and very important to remember that George Wallace ran as an independent and won 5 states as a Southern protest candidate in '68. Yeah. In '72, before he got shot, which took him off the stage, he was running as a Democrat, and won Democratic primaries. I believe the day after he was shot in Maryland, he won Maryland and Michigan primaries.
I think that's right. Yeah.
I mean, and had won Florida before that.
Right.
These are not like trivial states, Florida and Michigan, as a Democrat, which shows how much working class vote there was there.
Right. And Maryland's a
different.
Weird case, but Michigan's not exactly a Jim Crow state, you
know.
Right. And again, it's this amnesia about among liberals that these voters aren't part of their coalition when these voters were the essence of the Democratic coalition. Republicans have been winning college-educated whites forever. I mean, Barry Goldwater won among college-educated whites. It's non-college whites that have been the core of the Democratic Party forever, and now the response from liberal elites is to hold them in contempt. So there is a possibility that Trump brings them into the Republican Party, and if he's successful, they hold them there, right?
And how different is the Republican Party and the conservative movement, in which they're a much more
Yeah.
central part, I guess?
Well, I guess, again, I'm in a wait-and-see moment.
Is it a Nixon party or a Reagan party, to put it in a very simple way? I mean,
Well, so, our friend Steve Moore said last week, recently, that it's no longer the party of Reagan.
yeah.
And they asked me about this on NPR, and I was bleary-eyed. And the only thing I could come up with is I said, you need to understand that the best analogy I can come up with for this is that this is like the Pope saying, Jesus Schmeezus. I mean, for Steve Moore, who has been whipping anybody any deviationists from Reaganism, from pure Reaganism, for my entire adult lifetime, to all of a sudden say this is no longer Reagan's party is really kind of an amazing thing. So I don't know the answer to that. I do think that this is something that that people like us need to emphasize a lot, is that the way the Republican Party responds to rising populism, protectionism, changing demographics of the coalition has to be, by definition, very different from the way conservative intellectuals or the conservative movement responds to these things. It has never been our job to get people to turn out to vote. I mean, sometimes we get confused about that, but and I think I'm sure I brought this up on the last time we did this, but my favorite line from William Jennings Bryan is, the people of Nebraska are for free silver, therefore I am for free silver. I will look up the arguments later. Right? A politician can say that kind of thing, right? Who's the French intellectual who says, the people have chosen and I must go with them, for I am their leader, right? I mean, that is what politicians can do. If you actually claim to have anything like sort of principled conservative intellectual convictions, you can't say that 2 + 2 is now 5 because the voters say it's 5. And if that puts us a little bit on the outs of where the voters are and where the movement is, that's okay. I think that tension is probably healthy for everybody. The conservative movement was built on that tension.
Right.
And people, and this sort of gets to where we opened, is I love not feeling beholden to defend Trump when I think he's wrong. I defended Bush. I know you defended Bush. We had our disagreements with him about some second-order Medicare Part D and the Department of Homeland Security and that kind of thing. But he was a wartime president under attack, the most cynical, craven attacks from the left, trying to undermine a wartime president. And you felt like it was sort of a patriotic duty above sort of partisan duty to defend the guy. Maybe something will happen where out of patriotic duty I have to defend Trump, but I have no sense of partisan loyalty to defend the guy. But I'm happy to say he's right when he's right. And I think that is a healthy thing for conservative movement, where for too long we blurred the distinctions between being a conservative and a Republican.
And I would just almost underline the point by saying it's not just we have certain principles, of course we should defend them, but also I think we have to defend a true account of the last 70 years of history.
Yeah.
I mean, I think it's very important that people not think that American global leadership, which has included all kinds of things, and many foolish things, and unnecessary things, and screwed up things, but still has included a willingness to use the military. It's included free trade and pretty free movement of capital, pretty free trade. It's included being forwardly deployed. That's been good for the world and good for us. I mean, this was not automatically going to be the case that nuclear proliferation would be surprisingly slow since '45. That we would have rather few wars, especially since the mid '70s, late '70s. That you would have hundreds of millions, maybe billions of people liberated from poverty in East Asia, and so forth. So, I really, that the Soviet Union would fall, that the post-Soviet Union would mostly, with some hiccups, obviously, end up as reasonably free and democratic states. I mean, very important, I think, to defend on substance.
Right.
And these were mostly conservative policies, or conservative / centrist policies in the case of the anti-communism. Same with free markets. I mean, really, it's one thing for Hayek and Keynes to have an argument in the 30s and 40s, but are we really not going to say that after the experience of the reversals, whether it's China or India,
Right.
here, in fact, Israel even, when
Yeah.
Netanyahu liberates the economy, I mean, that generally speaking, freer markets and is a good, is
Yeah.
good for
Yeah,
a
yeah.
lot of people. I mean, I think it's important to not like get people are so wrapped up in this last year's election shows people are upset about trade. Well, fine,
Yeah.
and maybe they have right to be upset, and maybe there are things that have to be tinkered with, but I don't know. I mean, there really is a throwing out the baby with the bathwater danger, I think, in some of these areas.
No, I agree with that entirely. I think that's exactly right, and I think it's an important point. We've had so many controlled experiments over the last century. North Korea versus South Korea.
Right, right.
You just look at what the condition Cuba is in. I mean, the idea that somehow, not necessarily, Donald Trump isn't a socialist or anything like that, but there is a sense of, what's the right word, dirigiste, right? Or
Yeah.
command, like this stuff he's doing with Carrier.
Yeah, that's just today. So,
Yeah.
so we'll say a word about that since, so that's,
He jaw-jawed the CEO of Carrier to keep a bunch of jobs in Indiana, and on the merits of this one case.
and it's a great victory. It's mere president-elect he's already saving jobs, let alone what he'll do as president, That's-
Right.
so-
But there's a problem. First of all, of the president only has so much time in his day, and he can't be, just sort of jawboning every CEO out there. But also, there's a real moral hazard problem,
Right.
in the sense that now we know, or now a lot of CEOs know, that if they just announce that they're going to send some jobs to Mexico, they can expect a call from Donald Trump with some promises of some concessions to keep them in the country. And there's also just a long-standing tradition in American politics and economics that we don't single out individual companies. We're not even supposed to single out sectors.
Right.
That happens too much. But individual companies, that can lead to all sorts of problems. But this idea that that an individual politician is smart enough to outguess the market and outguess that can reject what Friedrich Hayek called the knowledge problem, and just he knows best what's for Carrier and best what's for Indiana. That argument cannot be allowed to be sustained. Right. I mean, this is a political one-off. Reagan it was protectionist for Harley Davidson. I mean, there are things that you get as a matter of politics, but as a matter of principle, we need to stay clear about this.
Yeah, and really, this is how you create Europe, a sclerotic European economy, incidentally, by not letting any firm lay anyone off.
Right.
Which is, I think a lot of people would say, is why you have, very slow growth and et cetera in Europe. I mean, there is something about the dynamism and vitality of the labor market here that really helps us. Now, we should do better at helping retrain workers and so forth, but
it accelerates the crony capitalism problem, right?
Right.
Because now, the problem with crony capitalism has been for a very long time that rather than looking to satisfying the consumer or meeting the demands of the market to make their bottom line and make a profit, they look to the regulatory environment in Washington. The message that comes from this is that Washington will fix your problems rather than smart economic decisions, smart business decisions. And, again, one can make way too much of this. This is maybe a one-off thing,
No, I agree.
fine. And it was part of a campaign promise he made in Indiana, and Mike Pence is the vice president, and he cares about this. But in principle, I think there's some troubling aspects to it.
Yeah, and I do think that, again, here we have experience as well as principles on our side. I mean, the arguments for constitutionalism, in a Hayekian sense maybe, was kind of theoretical question of what the wealth, but we've now had 50, 60 years of experience of moving away from limited government, constitutional forms, towards a kind of very intrusive welfare state / crony capitalist state.
Right.
And it's not good for anything, whether it's economic growth, I'd say free liberty, equal treatment under the rule of law. I do think that's where conservatives will have a big challenge. That is not Trump's instinct to care a lot about those things.
Well, also, it's a big. People used to make this point about Obamacare, that it was going to reorient our understanding about our relationship to the state. When you assume that the state can compel you to buy something, that the state is there to guarantee that you have health care, that changes your orientation towards your idea of government. The whole idea, which is a very traditional populist notion of I alone can fix it, right? That was Trump's big thing. That too changes your understanding about the role of the state. That somehow the state is there to solve all of your problems. Very Obama-esque.
Yep.
And it's got a more rightish, populist patina to it, but it is still the same sort of message. It's the individual, and it's the guy running the White House, and it's a sort of a monarchical understanding of the role of the state, which is not in accord with American tradition.
And certainly not with conservative
Right.
thought. I mean, I have this slightly kind of the contrarian view, maybe it's a hope, that the experience of Trump could lead to revitalization in a certain way of, let's call it the Hayekian and the constitutionalist and all the different strands we have of pro-limited government, pro-constitutional forms, pro-rule of law type thought, which has been somewhat, well, in the case of Obama, was a conservative argument against liberals, so it had a slight partisan feel to it. If made by conservatives against both Obama and Trump, has maybe more credibility, you might say, but it really would require actual political leaders, I suppose, to make this argument in Congress. Maybe they'll have some self-interest in doing so. It'd be nice if Congress stepped up instead of just yielding to the executive branch. But
I have this burning desire to make this case. I mean, I'm not an activist. I don't organize things. I don't put together groups. But it happens like clockwork. Whenever Republicans get into office, happened under Bush, happened a bit under Reagan, and it's happening in at blistering speed under Trump, and we're not even under Trump yet. All of a sudden, liberals and progressives rediscover the benefits of federalism.
right.
And when Republicans are in power, or when Republicans are out of power and they want federalism, it's because the assumption is automatically because Ted Cruz wants slavery again, right? And it's all this idiotic, paranoid nonsense, and that states' rights is purely a doctrine of preserving or restoring Jim Crow and slavery. But when a Republican's in office, all of a sudden, and you see this in college campuses, you get liberal kids who all of a sudden are much more receptive to the idea that, maybe if Oregon wants to be able to import raw cheese or have microbreweries that don't fit the EPA's or the FDA's definitions, whatever, that they should have the freedom to decide these things at a local level. And what I would love to see, it'd be a great thing for, the Koch people or Freedom Partners, one of those kinds of groups, to really try to organize and lock in as much of the left into these arguments now. Conferences, plebiscites or referenda or whatever, so that they can see it, because eventually the window is going to close again and they're going to think it's all about racism. And if we could get Republicans and libertarians to make this pitch the right way, you could actually see, I hate sanctuary cities. I think sanctuary cities are probably unconstitutional, and I don't like them and all the rest. But you can see in the logic in liberals all of a sudden clicking in. Well, wait a second, why is the federal government telling me how I can organize my city? Now, the problem is that immigration is actually a federal issue under the Constitution, but the logic is there. And if we could get more liberals and progressives to lock in and acknowledge that local control, community control is better, creates happier people, get them all to read Yuval Levin's book, I think that would be a great grassroots project for a sort of left-right synergy that gets us back somewhere closer to the correct constitutional order.
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, you mentioned libertarians. I'm struck that 2-3 years ago, the conventional view was probably, if there's going to be something new in the Republican Party this year that's not Bush, that's not Scott Walker, that's not more mainstream Republicanism, it's going to be Rand Paul and libertarianism. That's sort of an irony, right? We got something like the opposite of it, I would say, with Trump. So I don't know where, but maybe that libertarian. I still think there is some. There's a lot of empirical evidence that it's a good idea, and a lot of theoretical arguments for much more decentralized politics.
Right.
But maybe we need the left to embrace it against Trump. I don't know.
Well, I think, I know this is a little outside of our writ here, but I think it's a really important point that we have this populist moment where lots of people feel like global elites or national elites are running their lives and all the rest. And I think there's a lot of merit to that problem. That's the argument for pushing these things down to the most local level possible, because when you do that, first of all, cultural war issues become much easier to deal with because the winners have to look the losers in the eye, right? They have, you see, if you're against gay marriage, you see the people who are for gay marriage at your kid's soccer game and at the supermarket and all that kind of stuff. But moreover, it lets people at the local level know who to fire.
Right.
And if you look at things like the VA scandal, you had 435 congressmen who were all outraged about it, and there was no one to fire, And if you send all those functions back to the states, give the VA hospital in Arizona to the state of Arizona, then there's a local official that people know, that people can reach out to, that they can fire, instead of this faceless, amorphous sort of administrative state bureaucracy. And I think that would give a lot more people a sense that they have control over their politics, over their lives, and it would siphon off a lot of the sort of more bilious populism that's in the country right now.
So I think we think 2016 could well be a big deal politically. I mean, it could be a one-off, oddball thing, and we'll have a 2020 race or 2024 race that looks just like, I don't know, an old-fashioned, race. But what also has the sense that it's a kind of big cultural moment, a moment in the media, a moment in celebrity culture.
Sure.
You've written a lot about this, all these related issues over the years. I mean, what strikes you the most? The celebrity side of it, Trump's use of social media. There are a lot of different issues, a lot of things that happened, seem to have come together this year.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. And I think there's a tendency among conservatives to think that somehow we're outside this fishbowl looking in on the culture.
Yeah,
right?
Right,
and
right,
it's like, oh, can you believe what happened with the culture and all that kind of stuff? And it turns out that, we live in America, and we are in the culture too, and we watch a lot of the same TV shows.
And conservative voters are in the culture.
Yeah. And and we know from the data that all of these supposedly cultural problems that affect others are in fact affecting the white working class and white people. Divorce rates among sort of the top quintile haven't been a problem in a long time, but family breakdown among whites is as big a problem as it was among blacks when Moynihan report came out. And young conservatives speak pretty much in the same cultural vernacular as young liberals do. And they all hang out on Twitter, and they all hang out on Facebook or Instagram and all the rest. And so this idea that somehow conservatives are outside of it, I think, is overblown. To be sure, there are Orthodox Jews and evangelical Christians who are at a critical distance from some of the stuff in the culture, but it's very hard to be.
Yeah.
And so I think that the reason I bring this up is I think that to a certain extent, one of the reasons why a lot of conservatives, me included, didn't appreciate Trump's potential for success was how much he is, in fact, fully a creature of the popular culture. Yeah. And that the logic, the appeal of the undercurrents of the popular culture are actually much stronger than a lot of the rules of thumb that we apply to politics. And so when he would say things in the primaries, oh, that's going to kill him. And it wouldn't, because people were watching him as a creature from a slightly different dimension. They were watching him as the guy from The Apprentice and all the rest. And I remember people were saying throughout the early primaries, the laws of political gravity are eventually going to apply. The problem is that he was not under the jurisdiction of the laws of political gravity. He was under the jurisdiction of the laws of entertainment gravity. And he actually understood, he was a pretty good student of those laws.
Yes.
And so I do think, I think if I were a Bill Galston type liberal, I would be very worried about Trump, the precedent of Trump, not just because of all the usual hand-wringing stuff, but because I think what Trump proved is something that Obama gave us a hint of, that celebrity and cult of personality politics work better in this new media environment than they have worked since at least Kennedy, if not, going back much further. And that's a much bigger problem for liberals than it is, or for Democrats than it is for Republicans. We don't have a lot of celebrities. Is Ted Nugent going to run next time?
Right.
Meanwhile, I think if you had waited, if George Clooney or Tom Hanks had thrown their hat in 3 weeks before the election, they could have won the election. You have, the Kanye West types. There's all of these really popular personalities on the cultural left, the Hollywood left, that, if Jon Stewart ran for office, my God, the crowds he could get. And that is a long-term, if these trends continue, if Donald Trump is more a harbinger of cultural trends, then those cultural trends are going to affect the Democratic Party a lot more than they're going to affect the Republican Party.
But I suppose on the other hand, from a conservative point of view, don't we dislike or worry about the effects of these cultural trends even more than liberals or progressives?
Yeah, no,
Because
that's
we
absolutely true.
We believe in all these institutions that are being kind of just shoved aside, and mediating institutions, some of them we don't like the media, an important mediating institution. Still, at the end of the day, we probably don't think it's great that you can just sort of tweet things that are made
No,
up.
I agree with that
yeah.
entirely. I think, I do think sort of, I mean, talking about the cultural or the media landscape, I can't remember if we talked about this the last time I was here, but I've long argued or long believed that from about, I don't know, early 1930s through, call it like 1989, was basically not just the Cold War, and the Cold War it predates the Cold War, but it was a great parenthesis in American media landscape where, for reasons that come out of the rise of the telegraph and the radio, and then really live television, and the fact that we had raised sort of a generation and a half of Americans who had profound trust in big government and big institutions, there was this idea that the media was this objective, neutral arbiter outside of the cultural and political fights of the day that conservatives always knew was a lot of propaganda to it. But it was the myth of objective news. I mean, remember how Walter Cronkite would end his reports, and that's the way it is.
Right.
As if the sort of epistemological, existential hubris of being able to say, I am, Don Hewitt used to refer to the nightly news anchors as the voices of God, as if there was this omniscient view that they could capture. New York Times, all the news that's fit to print. Well, screw you. Maybe there's something that we think.
Right.
And that was something new in American history. It's something new in Western history. You never had that moment in Europe. In England, you have the Guardian, and you have the Times, and you have these partisan, not necessarily bad newspapers. They're still good newspapers, and if you look at the 19th century in America, all the papers were crazy partisan newspapers. And de Tocqueville talks about this, about how, the backbone of America, I'm going to butcher the quote, but it's the backbone of America is community or association, and the backbone of association are newspapers, because they were community builders, and there was a sense of belonging. And so there's this great stuff about the Lincoln-Douglas debates where the Democratic papers covering it said that Lincoln was so insensate from being crushed by Douglas that he had to be physically restrained. And the Republican papers said that Douglas was reduced to a quivering mass, of jello. And I think we're kind of returning to that, of these, I know from founding a National Review Online, I'm sure you find this at the Weekly Standard, that a big part of the role of these magazines has always been to cultivate a sense of intellectual, ideological community among a sort of ill-defined, but it's definitely their group of people. And that's what the internet has been for a very long time. That's what Salon was. That's what Red State, Huffington Post, they were all community builders. And that's where people get a lot of their political information. And I think we're returning to that sort of world. And in that sort of world, places like the New York Times have a hard time figuring out what their role is. And they try to sell themselves as sort of institutions of lifestyle and whatnot. But it comes across so smug and so condescending, and it's part of that liberal bubble. And in a much more free-for-all environment, someone like Donald Trump, who just decides he can give his phone to his id and say, "Run wild," you know. And I think people kind of find that refreshing. I don't. I find it kind of beneath the dignity of the office, first of all. But I do like watching the left sort of chase every single shiny thing that he coughs up like a hairball on Twitter. But for those of us who grew up during the Great Parenthesis, with these certain assumptions about how the media works and how you cover things and all the rest, this is much more of a Wild West moment with fake news and weird stuff and the damage that places like Breitbart are doing, and the ability of the internet to form instant virtual communities. And I'll give a weird example because it's an easy one to get your head around, and I'm not ascribing this to any political constituency. But if you were a pedophile 50 years ago, it was really hard to find somebody who shared your worldview or predilections, right? I mean, it's a hard conversation to go say, hey, that kid looks, it's a hard thing to do. Now the internet has created this ability for not just evil deviants like pedophiles, but like people who are into all sorts of Furbies or Dungeons and Dragons geeks or all these various video game kind of people, or the alt-right, where very quickly they can instantly get this sense that, first of all, their own personal views are reaffirmed and shared by large numbers of people, and that together they form a coalition or a constituency or a community that reinforces each other, that gives each other sort of psychic and emotional support, and that's a very different, formidable, new thing under the sun. And as conservatives, we're not supposed to believe in new things under the sun, but this is one of them. And how politics deals with some of that is going to be really interesting, and I don't have a good answer.
And it does seem like the gatekeepers, not just the New York Times, CBS, NBC, ABC type gatekeepers, but National Review, Weekly Standard type gatekeepers within the certain movements. Conservative. Of course, we failed this time. National Review had I contributed to it, a cover package, and a case against Trump, whatever it was called. And so, I mean, that also shows something, the ability to go around and these institutions, the direct communication, combined with being a celebrity, combined with a culture that rewards, I guess, a certain kind of brashness is a nice way of saying it, but, vulgarity, let's just say. And that is sort of new, I think. I mean, it has now spilled over into our politics, I guess. It's not new. Right. I mean, everyone's been lamenting, the state of the culture forever. Not forever, but for a long time. And correctly saying that, things that were not permissible to say in 1970 were said in 1990, and by 2010 they were the most mild things, so.
But I think Trump comes out of the Obama presidency for a reason, right? I mean, as our friend, your colleague Steve Hayes, probably just has a macro in his computer every time there's a terrorist attack. Why won't Obama admit that it's a terrorist attack, right? Right. But after every terrorist attack, the administration would slow walk. We don't know his real motives. Maybe it was, like what Bloomberg after the Times Square failed bombing, he was probably just an opponent of Obamacare. Yeah. And they're constant, this constant denial of the political international reality, never mind all this politics of transgender stuff and all that kind of thing, that somehow you're a bigot now if you think as a biological fact that women are the ones who carry babies to term, and all that kind of stuff. I think there's a sense out there, particularly among traditional older America, that the world has kind of lost its mind. And here comes Trump, who I reject the idea that he's purely un-PC, because he loves to use PC against his enemies. He just hates to have it applied to himself. But here's a guy who says it was terrorism. Here's a guy who says, that America used to be great when we had when we could call things by what they are. The left, understandably, hears bigotry. But then in the left, here's bigotry in everything, right? I mean, if you think everything is racist, you've lost your credibility to say something is racist. And so I think, in a sense, this is the most positive spin I can give Trump as a cultural phenomenon, is that, in Confucian, in feudal China, they had this thing called the rectification of the names, where in societies where the names for things in reality starts to become too separate, the names and the reality become too separate, you lose social harmony, you lose sort of a sense of the rightness of the world. And I think there are an enormous number of people, understandably and rightly, feel like the intellectual and cultural elites in this country are telling you constantly not to believe your lying eyes. And that if you believe any of the things that you grew up believing, that automatically means you're a racist. And every cop who shoots every guy with a gun, it doesn't matter what the context is, it doesn't matter why it happened, it's automatically a racist act. Even if the cop is black, or even if the victim was shooting people. There's this I can't remember his name, but there's this left-wing racial warrior guy on Twitter that I got into a spat with recently, who was talking about the Ohio State terror attack. And He says, so the white police officer who shot a black man is being hailed as a hero, without any recognition of the context that the black man was a Somali guy who was shouting Allahu Akbar and stabbing people with a butcher knife.
Yeah,
you know?
right.
But it's that sort of thing that I think drives a lot of people crazy. And here comes Trump saying that's all nonsense. The elites here are stupid, and I'm gonna, and part of the problem is I think that Trump is a charismatic personality in the sort of social science sense that.
Right.
Sort of like Obama was, that people impose upon him things that he doesn't actually reflect, but he's a vehicle for their aspirations, which is sort of a classic definition of a populist leader. And so a lot of people just feel like this is the guy who's going to smash political correctness, smash a lot of this stuff, and I think that's an understandable desire.
And I suppose one question is, I think political correctness has been so important to Trump's rise.
Yeah.
I very much agree with that. I mean, it would be unfortunate from my point of view, I guess, for the conservative reaction to political correctness to be, shock jock.
Right.
Thus, if that, whatever the word would be to capture that.
Right.
As opposed to an intelligent attempt to discuss reality and so forth. But maybe that's sort of inevitable that there's an overreaction and maybe you then hope to settle back into the middle or not, or you go to or this is the nightmare, I guess, scenario of the 20s, 30s. You get a crazy decadence. That's fine. I mean, this is a huge caricature, of course, but buy more crazy decadence, and then you get, crazy fascism. I mean, sort of, and that would be kind of the.
Well, this is the point I make on college campuses all the time when I talk to conservative college students. Just because rudeness is un-PC doesn't make it heroic or brave, right?
Right.
And it's a fine distinction. Being rude and crude, just for the sake of shock value, is almost the definition of asininity, right? I mean, like, I'm just going to be boorish and crass to shock people. Well, that's exactly what you raise your children not to be. But if there's a certain amount of rudeness or a certain amount of eye poking that is necessary to make a much more important political point, I'm more forgiving of it. And what I think a lot of conservatives don't understand about political correctness is, there's a lot of cultural Marxism in it, and there's a lot of sort of Nietzschean resentment in it, and all that stuff, and it's a vehicle for left-wingers to impose all sorts of stupid ideas in society. But for the average person on a college campus, a big chunk, not all of it by any stretch, but a big chunk of political correctness is an attempt to update manners to account for a more diverse society. Calling people by what they want to be called isn't caving into the left. It's politeness, it's decency. African Americans, for completely understandable reasons, didn't want to be called colored or Negro, and they want to be called black or African American. The idea that in 1968 a un-PC brave person wouldn't give into that is lunacy, right? And so it's a diverse society, and being un-PC as a matter of sort of knee-jerk principle, I think is in and of itself a kind of right-wing PC. Treat people with respect and dignity. Bill Buckley was very un-PC, but a better mannered person you'd never meet. Your dad, very un-PC, but one of the things that made him un-PC is that he was the kind of guy who would stand up when a lady entered a room and he'd pull out a chair, and he believed in good manners. And if we get, so it's one of these tensions in the culture where right now to have good manners is considered a violation of political rights. I hold doors open for women, and according to the left, that's somehow outrageous. And we got to figure out some of that stuff, and I don't think Donald Trump's approach is the right way.
I think feminism actually is one of the biggest contributors to and sort of makes life more problematic in this. But I agree in a way that conservatives don't do justice to, because if you're a young person on campus, we do live in a gender-neutral society, or in a society where one is told what legally it's supposed to be gender-neutral and is, and we're supposed to be kind of gender-neutral, but one also realizes men and women are different. It's not as if it's so obvious how one should treat people. I mean, obviously one shouldn't assault people on the one hand, and one shouldn't be insanely transgender on the other.
Right.
So but in terms of how actually one should go about one's life, as a 20-year-old, or with social interactions, and it's not so obvious to me what the quote right answer would be on that.
No, I know, and it's difficult for people to figure out. And most people want to be nice people, and then they're told they're bigots for trying to be nice people.
Right.
And also the extent to which intellectual elites, or at least academic elites, are making fools of themselves. I mean, I follow this Twitter account. I think it's a peer review study, and they
That's
just
an excellent one. Yes.
yeah, they had one the
Didn't
other.
we just see? They just had something particularly funny. Yeah.
Yeah, the other one the other day that this whole idea that
So these are just. This is an account that tweets out
real
links to real peer-reviewed journal articles.
right, and they're all ridiculous.
Studies. Yeah,
right,
totally
and
ridiculous.
this one had one that the whole idea that women don't have as deep voices as men is purely a social construct. Right. And my wife, who wrote a book about Title IX, has been following this stuff for much longer than most of us. I remember she reviewed, I think, for the Weekly Standard, a book called The Frailty Myth, where a leading feminist said it is just a myth that women don't have, if properly trained, the same upper body strength as men. And that doesn't, like, as a statistical matter, there are plenty of women who are stronger than me, right? But as a generality, there's a reason why weightlifters at the Olympics at the highest end are all men, and it has nothing to do with social constructs. It has nothing to do with gender norm hegemony. It has to do with biological facts. And when this stuff trickles down to normal people, and they're basically it's a mass scale of emperor has no clothes-ism that drives them crazy and makes them look to somebody or something that can smash it. And I think in that sense, there's something healthy about all of it.
Trump at least maybe blows things up enough to create a new
space. Yeah.
Yeah.
And that's possible.
And what is your sense of that? You speak on college campus a lot. I mean, campuses a lot. This is a broad cultural question, but I mean, on the one hand, one looks at millennials, and they're much derided. I think somewhat unfairly, actually, but they were all for Sanders. It seems like in the primaries, and that was kind of if you're conservative, a little worrisome. They're for some real retread socialist. And they're sort of more pro-political correctness than we are, I suppose. On the other hand, there's some ways in which one can look at them and say, there's some healthy things going on there. I mean, do you have a general view on this sort of where we are in the generations of late capitalism and of advanced cultural decadence and all that kind of thing?
Well, I mean, I'm torn about this kind of stuff because one, as a conservative, I am deeply sympathetic and prone to "you kids get off my lawnism."
Yeah, right.
And when I first came to Washington, I'm part of what they call Generation X, and I watched here.
So you're a little too young to be a baby boomer, right?
That's right, just barely. And I watched how baby boomers were the ones who were obsessed with these generational stereotyping,
Right, totally.
right?
Yeah.
And I find that generational stereotyping is basically a form of secular astrology. Like, oh, you were born during this demographic cohort,
Right.
therefore you must think this, right? And I hate the phrase "the greatest generation," just as way as an example, because it is a way to get bravery on the cheap. If you storm Normandy,
Right.
way to go! Thank you for your
Right.
service, right?
Right.
If you were in county jail but were the same age as the guys who stormed
Right.
Normandy, why do I get to call you the greatest generation? And so there's this idea of this sort of, of demographic or birth cohort transitive property of enlightenment or heroism or chivalry or any of these kinds of things is all nonsense. I believe in individuals, and so there are a lot. And so when I came to Washington, it was really dispiriting and infuriating how many fellow Gen Xers exploited baby boomers by claiming the mantle of identity politics. Oh, you have to include someone of my age group because you don't understand us and you can't get, as if like older people have never been young and don't
Right.
know what it's like to be young.
But this was this was the 90s, really, right?
It was a
This
very,
is big-
very 90s.
Let's have a TV show only with,
Right.
31-year-olds because
And
TV talk show,
And so there was a lot of that kind of stuff, and I always rejected it. And so I agree with you that there's a lot of good things going on. I mean, millennials are now the biggest demographic cohort, I think. I mean,
I think just past the boomers, right?
And so the idea that you could talk about any group of 74 million Americans, whatever the number is, with any sweeping generalizations is kind of nuts, right? And we do it because we're lazy journalists, and that's what lazy journalists do, is this attempt to sort of digitize rather than analyze the society and say, oh, this group believes
Right.
this. And So that said, I do think there's a real problem among kids at elite schools, where they, it's this amazing thing where, and I make this point on college campuses all the time. You know, if you go to a top 200 campus, right, a top 100 campus, and you're from an affluent family, you're not there on some sort of scholarship or whatever. But even if you are, as a general proposition, if you go to one of these schools, your food is paid for, your housing is paid for, your security is paid for, your heat is paid for, your electricity is paid for, your Wi-Fi is paid for, your books are paid for, your tuition is paid for. Much of your social life is paid for. Maybe you wait tables, maybe you don't, that kind of stuff. And yet you think you're incredibly independent, there is, I think you judge a lot of political movements by their definition of utopia. And I think that there's a thing, particularly in American liberalism, that sees the college campus as the definition of the healthy society, of the best society, where everything is taken care of. You're just supposed to explore your highest, best self. The greatest crime you can commit is to be mean to somebody. And I think that's a real problem. I also think that one of the reasons why political correctness is succeeding on college campuses, and I've written a bit about this, is that people like you and me are partly to blame. Parents are partly to blame. Political correctness, broadly defined, has been around since at least Adorno and Horkheimer and the Frankfurt School were doing their craziness, right? And it was as dumb and as weird and as stupid when Marcuse was talking about repressive tolerance and all this nonsense. It never got a foothold with very many people outside of a certain subset of radical left-wingers on college campuses until this generation. And I think a friend of mine, Steve Horowitz at St. Lawrence University, has written about this. Jonathan Haidt has written about this. What you had happen was in the late 1980s, there were a series of kidnappings of little kids. And that was part of this sort of freak out among parents about not letting your kids just run wild and that their lives had to be planned. And as particularly among affluent people, I see this with my own daughter and I try to fight it. It's hard. You see these parents whose kids have their days scheduled to a fare thee well, and they're driven from this, and they're driven from that, and there's very little free range play. And so we've raised among elite kids this entire generation, again speaking in grotesque generalities, of kids who have never had, in a significant way, the need or the ability to, or the opportunity to settle interpersonal disagreements on their own. There's always a third-party intercessor. There's a coach, there's a teacher, there's a parent, someone who comes in and says, oh, you and Billy have to play nice. And we know from social science that kids really need rough and tumble play in order to understand how to navigate interpersonal relations. And so as Steve Horowitz points out, he says, what would you expect when you get a generation of kids raised this way and they go to college and they're away from home for the first time? Well, first of all, they would want a much more aggressive in loco parentis from the administration. They have never really dated. They don't know how to deal with interpersonal sexual, stuff. And so they might want a contract that explains what the rules are, right? And if they take a class where someone says something or they teach something or they expose them to something that is scary or makes them feel uncomfortable, well, maybe they want a trigger warning. And so, the left, women's studies departments have been around for a long time, teaching utter nonsense for a long time. And I know this having gone to an all-women's college.
Previously all-women's college, I trust.
My freshman year was
unless
year,
there's
yes.
a transgender
Yes.
issue,
No,
we don't know.
that's right. I'm the Rosa Parks at gender integration.
Excellent.
And but it never had a wide appeal beyond a very small subset of kids. And now you get the rank and file kids who have grown up as these protected creatures buying into the arguments of political correctness in a way that I don't think they ever have before. And it's a real challenge. And I think the issue starts at the home. Helicopter parenting is a sign of this problem, where you just, you need, like, when I grew up in New York City in the 1970s, my mom, dad kicked me out of the house and said, you and your brother go play, and, I was mugged. I mean, it was a different place. I'm raising my daughter in the 1950s, and I worry about these things. And I see it among her friends and her kids at school, where everyone's really nice, but they don't know how to navigate life in a way that I think kids from previous generations did.
Yeah, it's interesting. I share also your dislike of all the generational stuff, which became such a pop sociology thing at some
Yeah.
point. I'm not sure exactly. I guess with boomers really, but I mean, with the greatest respect for many people in the greatest generation, my parents and so forth. But of course, the greatest generation's kids were the baby boomers. So if it was such a great generation, how come they produced all these
Right.
rebels of the '60s? Who were their parents? Their
Right.
parents were people who fought in World War II, almost by definition. If you just look at the chronology, almost. So
Well, one of the reasons, according to some sociologists, was guilt. Their parents did this great, amazing thing. We had to
Right.
do something great and amazing.
and the parents spoiled the kids because they went through the Depression, and
Right.
this was finally a chance to give your kid stuff you didn't have growing up, and so suddenly you get it. Yeah, so I mean, life is complicated, and there are these backs and forths. I do think on the cultural side, the one germ of truth in the people do have in the generational stuff is people, and I'd like your thoughts on this. And people have some sense that, well, it doesn't matter when you grow up chronologically, in the sense that the technology is very different and the culture is very different, and that growing up in a world of Facebook, email, Twitter is probably a different experience
Yeah.
than growing up in the 50s or the 80s. I mean, which had their own odd things, you could say, that were different from previous generations.
Right. Right.
People used to have long debates about TV. What effect is TV having on our kids? But
Right.
I mean, that seems to be dwarfed, right, by the
And
by
kids aren't
social
watching
media.
TV the way they used to
Right.
anymore either. No, I agree with that entirely. And I think to the extent that generation analysis has merit, is much more a story of the technology that you grew up with and how it deals with how it relates to culture and all the rest. And I did think that this is a point that, again, conservatives have struggled with for a very long time. Conservative intellectuals in particular really love to argue about ideas. We just love ideas, right? And we want to have arguments, and ideas have consequences and all that kind of stuff. And certainly that's how we make a living, right? And so I'm not excluding myself from that. But if you go back and you just look at social history, the breakdown of the family begins and has much more to do with the rise of the automobile than it does with any idea that escapes some East German lab, right? And the problem is that you can argue with Nietzsche. You can't argue with a Buick, right? And that's the sort of problem, is that
Or the internet.
or the internet. The internet is just out there, and you can grapple with it. You can make arguments about how to deal with it, but I think it's Karl Hess said, that tools have more to do with, changing humanity than Jesus did, or something. I mean, there's this. I think one can overdo some of that stuff, but technology is a huge driver of social organization, social understanding, art. There's a reason why art has become more abstract and more ridiculous, and some of it has to do with all sorts of bad ideas, but some of it also has to do simply with the invention of the camera.
Yeah, so you don't. Right.
And so you have to all of a sudden embrace art as an expression of an idea rather than a representation of nature or reality, because it turns out technology is better at it than anybody with a paintbrush is ever going to be.
And feminism and the sexual revolution are big deals, but the pill is kind of a big deal.
That's right.
It's a
The pill drives a
contribution
lot
to
more
that.
stuff.
So no, I agree with you. I mean, conservatives have always loved that. I think it's from Richard Weaver, a book of his essays. Ideas have consequences. I think that Heritage used it as like a motto for decades, maybe. And of course, yes, as you say, people like us want to believe that, and we do ultimately, I think, believe that.
Sure.
That fundamentally that's probably the case. But yes, technology has a lot of consequences, and there you can't just rebut technology. You have to think about how to adapt it, use it, curb it, maybe.
Right.
And we were talking before off camera about Daniel Bell and the cultural contradictions of capitalism. That's always been a powerful argument, that it's not. No one sat around necessarily. I mean, some people did sit around thinking about they wanted to be against capitalism.
Right.
But a lot of it is capitalism develops in a way where it turns out begins with thrift and then goes to consumerism and then ends up in Trumpian debt and bankruptcies and lavish showing off and sort of semi-fake, products. And some of that, I don't know how much that's driven by critiques of capitalism or.
Well, that's the thing. I have a lot of views on this because I'm working on a book that's right up out of all this stuff. And one of the things I think people don't appreciate is that capitalism, a lot of it comes out of Locke, obviously, right? And that sort of political tradition of liberalism and the philosophes and all of that. But you take Max Weber's Protestant work ethic and the spirit of capitalism, which is still sort of one of the main arguments about where capitalism comes from and all the rest. The Puritans or the Protestants who, it's not the Puritans, who am I thinking of? Who are the predestination guys?
Calvinists.
The Calvinists and those guys, right? I mean, they didn't say, oh, we have to adopt this new understanding of market economics in order to get into heaven. It was that in order to get into heaven, we have to live as if we were selected to get into heaven, and that means living upright, decent lives of thrift, hard work, and all the rest. And it turns out that if you do those things, it throws off these benefits of affluence and all the rest. And so many of, capitalism depends on values and virtues that it cannot create and cannot restore once lost. And I think this is another point that your dad would make, quite eloquently in one of my favorite essays of his, when virtue's lost its loveliness or something like that.
When virtue loses its loveliness, which
Yeah.
is a quote, I guess, from Fitzhugh, I believe, a Southern slave defender.
Some Southern
who was
guy.
sort of attacking Northern industrial society
Right.
for destroying lovely things
Right.
in the course of this implacable progress of industrialization.
And we should be clear, your dad was not on
Yes,
his side of the
no,
argument to the slavery
not at
part.
all, not at all.
But
Shows how far back the critique of capitalism.
And well, I mean, this critique of capitalism stuff goes back to Eustace Moser and medieval Germany and all that, the problem that you get into, which gets back to Daniel Bell, I think, is that when you live in a purely consumerist society where you listen to the way Donald Trump defends his wealth and his behavior as a businessman, it has nothing to do with the virtues that gave birth to capitalism. It's all like, I was just trying to maximize profit. I was greedy for me. I mean, he keeps talking about how he's greedy for me. That is not how Adam Smith would talk about it. It's not how most of the robber barons, who weren't really robber barons, would talk about these
Andrew
things.
Carnegie would not have said that.
Yeah, and I know some very wealthy people who don't like Donald Trump because he thinks he gives rich people a bad name. And but we live in a society where you can claim that anything you did, bribe politicians, all the rest, which Trump has basically admitted, is worthwhile if it helps your bottom line. And that sort of thinking spells the end of capitalism, rightly understood. But we live in this culture. I mean, you see it in things like rap music. This, it's all about the Benjamins. It's all about the money. That is not actually capitalism or conservatism properly understood. And I think we're going to need to figure out a way to get back to talking about how these virtues are good in their own sense, regardless of whether or not they make you rich or happy.
Yeah, it would be amazing. I mean, I sort of have the sense, too, that Obama sort of takes nanny-statism to a pretty far down that road. I mean, Life of Julia, the thing we all mocked, but for all we know was pretty effective in 2012. Right. That was that cartoon about this apparently single woman who kept getting good things from the government. So that was sort of Obama's vision of democracy, not what we all would like to see in terms of vigorous self-government and taking care of yourself and self-reliance and stuff. And then Trump takes in away a certain aspect of capitalism to a kind of ludicrous extreme and dead end. Maybe out of this you get a kind of cultural reaction and reformation, which would be a pretty amazing irony of history moment, right? If we get constitutional revival out of Trump, we get a kind of cultural revival out of the most vulgar person ever to be in the White House. I like that idea, actually.
Yeah, I like that idea, but there's also the possibility. I mean, it's a little off topic, but when Steve Bannon says, "I'm not a white nationalist," this is Trump's senior advisor now, is the CEO of the campaign. I'm not a white nationalist. I'm an economic nationalist.
Yeah.
I take him at his word. I don't think he's a racist. I think he's an incredibly cynical man who exploited a bunch of racists, even if he disagreed with them. But this idea that economic nationalism isn't simply nationalism is nonsense. There's never been a society that embraced nationalism that didn't embrace economic nationalism, and economic nationalism properly understood is essentially either socialism or some sort of command economy stuff. And nationalism is not conservatism. Bill Buckley used to say that he was as patriotic as anybody in the world, but there wasn't an ounce of nationalism in him. And what I worry about is that instead of this glorious revival where he's like this antibody that,
Right.
this sort of macrobiotic thing that turns on our immune systems and revives democracy, is that has this catalytic effect on more tribalism. It's certainly the left's response.
And that certainly seems, just looking at the world, there's quite a lot of evidence of that.
Yeah, all around the world,
Yeah.
we're in a sort of tribalist.
The
nationalist
reaction
moment.
to the nanny state, welfare state, political correct state has been a tribalist revival.
Right.
Not what we would think of as a healthy, conservative,
Right.
revival.
Although it's interesting, I was reading a book by Ernest Gellner where he made this argument I had never heard before, and I'm not a real Hayek geek, but I'm close, and he made this argument that Hayek and his colleagues at the Austrian school in Vienna embraced their limited government, constitutional, free market, rule of law stuff as a response to the swarthy dark hordes of Bohemians and Hungarians who were coming in to Vienna at the time. And I'd never heard this argument as Hayekianism as a sort of racist response. But the reality is that I spent a lot of time thinking about this. Even if that's true, and I'm not sure that I buy it, that's the right response, right? The right response is
Rule of
not
law.
to say we are going to have one set of rules for the white Viennese upper crusters and another set of rules for all of it. It's that everyone's going to be judged by the same standards. It's going to be the rule of law. It's going to be limited government, and everybody has to behave the same, has to obey the same set of rules and structures. And that is what I would hope is the response to Trump, not to say that he's perfectly analogous to a bunch of swarthy Bohemians, in
Right.
fin de siècle Vienna. But I think it's, but that's the right response from conservatives, is to double down on this idea of what Arthur Brooks would call the innate human dignity of everybody, of this idea of, simple rules for a complex society, not picking winners and losers, and that's where I think we should go.
Yeah, and you could have almost, again, it would be an irony of history, a kind of Hegelian thing where you get liberal political correctness, a kind of unpleasant and bad, nationalist, ethnic nationalist,
Right.
ethno-nationalist reaction, but then out of it, somehow people decide neither is what you want, and you end up with, sort of more
I mean, that's the theory of,
old-fashioned rule of law, limited government, and so forth. I mean,
isn't that the theory? I know it's come under some criticism, but the theory of where secular pluralism comes from is that you had these religious wars in Europe. Turned out that particularly that they realized you're never going to kill all the Huguenots, you're never going to kill all the Catholics.
Right.
So maybe we got to do is put away our swords and figure out to have this safe zone in the public where everybody is treated equally. And maybe that's the response that we'll get from this new tribalism.
Of course, you needed John Locke and others to then invent, and Montesquieu and the founders to sort of invent a theory that makes that more possible than just a standoff status quo,
Yeah, but fortunately,
truce.
Locke has done a lot of that work
Yes,
for
well,
us
that's
already,
true.
and
So
we
you
have
just-
you to
No,
update
I was
on
going
it.
to say you, so it's a good note to end on. So, Jonah, thanks so much for joining me
Thank
today.
you
It was
very
really
much.
great.
Appreciate
And
it.
thank you for joining us on Conversations.